I was 32 the day my sister got married, and though the sun poured golden light across the courtyard, I remember feeling like a storm cloud had followed me into that place. My name is Isabel, and I've lived my whole life in the quiet shadows, the older sister who sacrificed, who endured, who carried, but was never quite noticed, until the weight broke me open. That wedding became the day everything I had buried came rushing to the surface, the betrayals, the secrets, the cruelty disguised as civility. And in the middle of it all, stood a man who thought I was invisible until I showed him exactly who I was. Our story began years before when tragedy turned our lives inside out. My sister Ashley and I were raised mostly by our father. Our mother had left when we were little, remarrying and disappearing into another life. Dad wasn't perfect, but he was present, and we thought that was enough. Then one morning when I was finishing college and Ashley was still in high school, the phone rang. A car accident, Dad didn't make it. No one prepares you for grief that sudden. One moment you're laughing about weekend plans, the next you're making funeral arrangements. Worse, when Dad died, the debt he had been hiding surfaced like vultures. The house, the cars, even the office building gone. Ashley and I were left with nothing but 2 suitcases and each other. I was only 22, but overnight I became both guardian and provider. While my classmates planned parties and internships, I stacked shifts, barista at dawn, delivery driver by night, temp assistant in between. I barely slept, but I couldn't let Ashley fall. Every penny went to rent, food, and keeping us alive. When boyfriends left because I had no time for them, I swallowed the pain. When relatives judged, I kept quiet. When people looked past me, I let them, because survival doesn't leave room for pride. Years blurred into a rhythm of sacrifice. I finished college, landed a corporate job to keep us steady, then joined 2 friends building a small startup. It was brutal, late nights, endless failures, but I believed it was the only way out of the endless scraping. And slowly, against all odds, it worked. Our tool caught attention, companies started calling, and though I didn't crave the spotlight, I became part of something real. But no matter what I achieved, my focus was always Ashley. I wanted her safe, happy, free of the weight I had carried. When she introduced me to the man she wanted to marry, I was cautious, but I trusted her joy. She deserved love. I told myself I could endure whatever awkwardness his family brought because this was her day, not mine. But nothing could have prepared me for meeting his father. The first time I shook his hand, he barely looked at me. He tilted his head, frowned slightly, and said, "Oh, you're just her sister. I assumed her parents would be here." My heart clenched, but I answered evenly, "Our father passed away years ago." He blinked, unimpressed, then moved on as though I'd said nothing. Later, when he asked what I did for a living, I told him I worked corporate, keeping it vague. I knew his type, the kind who weighed a person's worth in salaries and titles. He dismissed me with a nod, already filing me under insignificant. I left that meeting with a pit in my stomach, but I swallowed it. I told myself his arrogance wasn't worth the energy. Still, a seed of anger rooted in me, quiet but deep. The wedding came on a dazzling afternoon, the kind of day you wish you could bottle forever. Ashley looked radiant, and I wanted only to shield her happiness. But the moment her father-in-law passed me at the reception, his eyes flicking over me with deliberate dismissal, the storm inside me stirred again. I was used to being overlooked, but that day on my sister's wedding in front of everyone, I felt myself harden. When the organizer announced I was next for a speech, my hands trembled. I hadn't planned to speak, but as I walked toward the microphone, something inside me shifted. I wasn't just going to talk about Ashley. I was going to tell the truth of who we were, what we survived, and why I wasn't someone to be dismissed. My palms were slick with sweat as I wrapped my fingers around the microphone. The crowd quieted, their faces turned toward me with polite expectation. I could see Ashley watching me with wide, nervous eyes. She hadn't asked me to speak. Her groom reached for her hand under the table, a reflex of reassurance. And then there was him, her new father-in-law, seated with his chest puffed, his eyes already drifting past me as if he could erase me with indifference. I took a breath, and for the first time in years I didn't shrink. I wasn't planning to say anything tonight. I began, my voice shaking at first, but growing steadier with each word. But seeing my little sister here starting a new life, I can't stay quiet. I spoke about Ashley, how radiant she looked, how proud I was of her. But quickly my words shifted, drawn by the gravity of everything we had lived through. Most of you don't know our story, I said. When Ashley and I lost our father, we didn't just lose a parent. We lost the roof over our heads, the safety net we thought we had. Suddenly we were on our own. A murmur rippled through the room. Glasses clinked uneasily. I could feel Ashley stiffen, but I pressed on. I was 22 when I became not just a sister, but a provider. I worked every job I could find. I carried rent, groceries, bills, and school fees on my shoulders. And I did it without complaint because she deserved to have a future, even if it meant I sacrificed my own youth to make it happen. Silence spread through the hall. I saw Ashley's eyes glisten. Her groom looked at me differently now, his expression tightening. And her father-in-law, his face paled, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. I leaned closer to the mic, steady now, my voice sharp. So when someone looks at me and assumes I am insignificant, when someone dismisses me as just her sister, without knowing what I bled to keep her standing here today, I want to make this clear: I am not invisible. I am not irrelevant. I am part of why this moment exists at all. Gasps rose from the tables. A few people shifted uncomfortably. The groom's father shifted too, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. I smiled then, not cruelly, but with the quiet power of someone who had been underestimated too many times. I've built a career, a company, a life that I'm proud of. And I stand here tonight, not for recognition, but for truth. Because family is not defined by arrogance or wealth, or bloodlines that look good on paper. Family is defined by sacrifice, by loyalty, by love that doesn't quit even when the world tries to break you. Ashley was crying openly now, her mascara streaking. The groom put his arm around her, his expression unreadable, and the father-in-law. He couldn't meet my eyes. His face had gone ashen, his superiority stripped bare in front of the very people he had wanted to impress. I finished with a lift of my glass. To Ashley. May your marriage be built on the kind of love that endures, the kind that lifts you up instead of tearing you down. May you never forget where you come from, and may you always honor the sacrifices that made you who you are. Applause erupted, hesitant at first, then stronger. People rose to their feet. Not for me, perhaps, but for the undeniable truth of what I had laid bare. I set the microphone down, my heart hammering, and returned to my seat. Ashley reached for my hand, gripping it tight, whispering, "Thank you." And across the room, her father-in-law sat frozen. His power drained, his secrets trembling at the edges of revelation. Because what he didn't know yet, what no one in that room knew, was that I wasn't finished. That speech was only the beginning. The rest of the evening unfolded like a storm barely contained. Guests laughed and clinked glasses, but the undercurrent was there everywhere I walked. Whispers followed. I could feel eyes flicking between me and Ashley's new father-in-law, who had grown uncharacteristically quiet. He avoided me completely, staring down at his plate, or at the band playing soft music in the corner. His arrogance had cracked, and beneath it I saw something rawer, almost like fear. I didn't know why at the time. I only knew that his pale face told me I had hit a nerve far deeper than mere wounded pride. Later, as people drifted onto the dance floor, Ashley pulled me aside. Her hands were trembling. "Izzy, what you said, it was powerful, but do you know what you've done?" I studied her, my heart aching at the conflict in her eyes. I told the truth, I said quietly. "Isn't that what weddings are supposed to celebrate?" She bit her lip. "It's more complicated than you think. His father, he's not who he pretends to be." The words stuck with me, chilling me even as she was pulled away by her new husband. Complicated. Pretend. Secrets I hadn't even touched yet. As the night wore on, I caught snippets of conversations, murmurs cut short when I walked by. At one point I saw the groom arguing with his father near the terrace, voices raised, faces tense. The elder man gestured wildly, his hand slicing the air, but his son shook his head, jaw clenched before storming off. It wasn't until much later, when the crowd had thinned and the music softened, that he approached me. Ashley's husband, Mark, his face still taut with anger. "You don't know what you stirred up," he said, his voice low, urgent. "But maybe it's time someone did." I waited, breath caught, as he glanced over his shoulder to where his father sat, with a stiff drink in hand. He's built his life on lies. Deals that weren't his money that wasn't earned. He married my mother for her family's wealth, then bled her dry. And Mark cut himself off, shaking his head. He can't stand strong women, especially women who see through him. The puzzle pieces clicked with terrifying clarity. His dismissal of me, his need to assert control, it wasn't personal. Not really. It was the way he operated, the way he crushed people into silence, so his power would never be questioned. But I wasn't silent anymore. The rest of the night I carried myself differently. Not just the forgotten sister, not just the background caretaker. I knew now that my instincts were right, that his disdain wasn't harmless. It was a weapon, and he had wielded it for years. And though I hadn't set out to be anyone's reckoning, part of me realized I had just become the one person willing to challenge him. When the last guests drifted out and Ashley hugged me tight before leaving for her honeymoon, her father-in-law finally approached. His voice was low, almost a growl. "You should learn when to keep your mouth shut." I met his stare without flinching. "And you should learn that the truth doesn't disappear just because you don't like it." His face tightened, his jaw working as if he wanted to spit venom but couldn't find the words. And for the first time I felt taller than him. That night, lying awake in my hotel room, I thought about everything, about Dad, about the years of sacrifice, about the way Ashley's happiness seemed tethered to a family bound by secrets. I realized this wasn't just about being dismissed or humiliated. This was about generations of women being silenced, about men like him who thrived in the shadows of power. And deep inside me, a seed of vengeance began to bloom. I didn't yet know how or when, but I knew this: he would regret underestimating me. The morning after the wedding, I checked out of the hotel with a gnawing restlessness in my chest. The sunlight felt too sharp, the air too thin. I couldn't stop replaying his words, the venom in his tone. "You should learn when to keep your mouth shut." It wasn't just arrogance anymore. It was a warning. A man like that didn't get pale at a sister's speech unless there was something worth hiding. Ashley called me from the airport before her flight. Her voice was hushed, almost trembling. "Izzy, please, don't get involved. I know how he treated you, but if you start digging, it'll only bring trouble. For me, for Mark." Her plea cut me deeper than I expected. She was afraid not for herself, but for what might happen if the truth came out. That told me everything I needed to know. The man wasn't just an overbearing father-in-law. He was a parasite feeding off silence and fear. I promised her I wouldn't stir anything while she was gone. But promises made in fear are not promises meant to be kept. The days that followed became a blur of curiosity and quiet investigation. I had contacts from my startup days, people who could pull records, find connections, dig where most wouldn't dare. And what came back chilled me to the bone. Business filings, property deeds, financial transfers, so many of them traced not to him, but to his late wife's family. He had siphoned her inheritance through shell companies, disguising it as investments. Worse still, there were whispers: unpaid debts to dangerous men, favors traded in smoke-filled back rooms, partnerships broken by betrayal. A man who had built his empire not with sweat but with manipulation. The more I read, the more I thought of Ashley's wide eyes, of Mark's clenched jaw, of the way guests at the wedding had glanced at him with respect that wasn't earned, respect built on lies. I wasn't sure when it shifted from curiosity to something sharper, but one evening, staring at the files spread across my kitchen table, I realized I wanted him exposed. Not for me, not even for Ashley, but because men like him thrived only as long as the rest of us bowed our heads. It started small. A whisper here, a document there. I knew people in media who loved a scandal, especially one dripping with hypocrisy. I didn't have to say much, just nudge the right information in the right direction. Weeks later it broke. A headline, bold and damning, about questionable dealings tied to his companies. The kind of story that gnawed at reputations like rust. Suddenly his name wasn't spoken with respect at charity galas, but with suspicion. Invitations dried up, partners withdrew, and Ashley, still abroad, called me in a panic. "Did you do this?" she demanded. I hesitated, then answered honestly. "I didn't create his sins. I just stopped letting him hide them." Silence. Then a sob. Not of anger, but of release. You don't know what this means. You don't know how long we've lived under his shadow. Her words were all the confirmation I needed. The fallout was swift. His associates abandoned him. His wealth built on a house of cards began to crumble. And the man who had sneered at me dismissed me, warned me to stay silent. He was now the one being silenced by the roar of his own lies unraveling. But it wasn't triumph I felt, not entirely. There was satisfaction, yes, in seeing justice coil back around him like a snake. But there was also grief for Ashley, for Mark, for the cracks this would carve into their marriage before it had even begun. For the family dinners that would never be warm, for the father-in-law whose shame would bleed onto everyone around him. And yet, some things deserve to be broken. Because I had spent too many years of my life patching broken things, holding them together with sacrifice, swallowing my worth so others could feel whole. This time I let it all fall. I didn't know yet where it would end. But I knew this: I had stopped being invisible. And he had finally learned that underestimating me was the last mistake he would ever make. The weeks after the scandal erupted felt like watching a storm devour a house I once stood outside of, powerless to enter. Except this time I wasn't powerless. I had been the spark that lit the match, and the fire spread faster than I could have imagined. Everywhere I went, his name was no longer met with reverence, but with suspicion. His face, once plastered across glossy magazines and charity programs, now appeared in newspapers under headlines that made his empire look like a cautionary tale. Lawsuits followed. Former partners came forward. Even those who had once clung to his coattails scrambled to distance themselves. And through it all I stayed silent. Ashley and Mark returned from their honeymoon to a family in shambles. I met them at my apartment, the weariness in their faces telling me more than words could. Ashley threw her arms around me, whispering, "I thought I'd come home to safety. Instead, it feels like quicksand." Mark sat heavily in the armchair, burying his face in his hands. "You were right," he said hoarsely. "You saw him for who he is. I didn't want to believe it, but he's ruined everything." I studied him, the son of a man whose shadow stretched long. And for the first time, I didn't just see a husband for my sister. I saw a boy who had grown up suffocating under expectations manipulated by the man who had orchestrated it all. He wasn't my enemy. He was another victim. But even as their world crumbled, Ashley's father-in-law clung to his pride. He avoided public appearances, but behind closed doors he lashed out. He called Ashley ungrateful, accused Mark of betrayal, even tried to confront me once at a cafe. His voice had lost its edge, though it cracked with desperation, his hands shaking as he spat. "You've destroyed me." I looked him in the eye, calm, steady. "No," I told him. "You destroyed yourself. I just stopped covering the wreckage." He didn't answer. For the first time, his silence wasn't superiority, it was defeat. In the months that followed, Ashley and I grew closer than we had been in years. She confessed things I hadn't known: that her father-in-law had belittled her in subtle ways, questioned her worthiness to marry into their family, always reminding her of what she supposedly lacked. He made me feel small. She admitted one night, tears slipping down her cheeks. "But when you spoke at the wedding, it was like you gave me permission to stand tall." Her words sank into me with a bittersweet warmth. I had spent so long carrying her, protecting her, often at the cost of my own life. And yet maybe that was the point. Maybe all that sacrifice had led to this moment, not just her happiness, but her freedom from a man who would have crushed her spirit the way he had tried to crush mine. Still, I couldn't ignore the hollow ache that lingered. Revenge, I realized, is never as clean as you imagine. It doesn't erase the years of pain. It doesn't give back the youth I lost, the nights I cried in silence, the dreams I buried. It only balances the scale enough so that the weight no longer buries you alive. But that in its own way was enough. I began writing down the story, not for the world, not for headlines, but for myself. Pages filled with memories I had tried to bury: my father's sudden death, the years of scraping by, the sting of being overlooked. And through it all, I threaded the truth I had finally learned: that invisibility is a prison we sometimes build for ourselves. But it's also one that can be broken the moment we refuse to stay quiet. One evening, Ashley sat with me as I read a passage aloud. She squeezed my hand. "You're stronger than anyone I know, Izzy. Don't ever let anyone take that from you again." And in her eyes I saw not pity, not dependence, but respect, at last. The man who had tried to erase me would live out his days in the ruins of his own making. But me, I would walk forward lighter, fiercer, unafraid. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever been dismissed, betrayed, or underestimated, I want you to hear me. Your worth is not measured by their blindness. You are more than the shadows they push you into. Step into the light, even if your voice trembles. Especially then, because your truth has power. If my story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment below. Tell me if you've ever had to fight to be seen. Because your story matters too. And together we remind the world betrayal doesn't break us. It reveals the strength we've carried all along.